I'm also joined by Elizabeth Warren. Elizabeth Warren has worked for IOM, the International Organization for Migration, since 2001. She's currently the Labor Migration and Development Specialist in IOM's Labor and Facilitated Migration Division at the organization's headquarters in Geneva. We're so glad that she could join us from Geneva today.
Thank you to the UN Foundation for having invited me, and to all of you for being here this afternoon to listen to us and to interact and give your perspectives. Despite my very English-sounding name and my very English-sounding accent, I'm actually also part of the diaspora. My mother is Sicilian, so I am Anglo-Sicilian, living in Switzerland. And maybe I can start with why I'm with IOM, because like any other diaspora, I graduated and I felt that I should give back to the country that I come from, which is Italy. And I went to Italy, to Padova, to teach English for a year. A lot of Italians, unfortunately, don't speak English, so I thought this was one way I could help. And when I was living in a community in the north, I found that some of my friends who I considered very dear, who happened to be foreigners themselves, really faced very strong discrimination. That the country that I was really proud of, because I was Italian, was actually still facing difficulties, having been an emigration country for many, many years, and Italians being here and elsewhere in the world, but perhaps struggling a little bit to cope with the immigrants that were coming and staying and residing there. So I felt to myself, well, I really want to do something about this. And as a direct result of that experience, I moved to Albania and helped work with the government of Albania to create the first national strategy on migration, which specifically includes provision of outreach to the diaspora for Albania. So that's a little bit why I started and how I ended up with where I am now. Now this is a very difficult panel, global issues. Where do you start? For an organization like IOM, which is affiliated to the UN, has 132 member states, member countries worldwide, has 450 offices, that deals with various aspects of migration management, not just diasporas. We deal with aspects like return, we deal with aspects relating to irregular migration, but my work specifically deals with migration and development. Well, what are the key challenges? Well, we all know that the diaspora are critical to addressing global issues, but perhaps it's not always so apparent why. And I think the last day of discussion, we've really had some very concrete contributions as to what we, the diaspora, can bring back to our home countries. And that relates to the transfer of skills, resources, knowledge transfer, and the real benefits of the diaspora returning as opposed to somebody else with no linkage is obviously the connections to the language, to the culture, to the networks and contacts that we have back in the country that we identify with. And this is really part of the social capital that we can bring back. However, one specific challenge that struck me as being particularly important is where we think about diaspora engagements in fragile states. Now that is of particular relevance, as all of us know, because perhaps the state is too weak, perhaps it lacks the necessary resources to engage with its diaspora, and it faces more pressing challenges, like the provisions of basic services and structures in the country itself. And perhaps on the other side, there are challenges from the diaspora members. Maybe they don't even want to contribute back. Maybe, in fact, they see the government that is in power as being very, very different from the ideals or the values that they hold dear, coming to a different country, having left, perhaps fled as a refugee to be in that country. So as an organization, IOM has been working very closely with a number of entities, including the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, to look at some of the ways in which diasporas might be able to contribute to institution building. Now, why institution building? You might ask, well, we as the diaspora can go back and we can contribute in many ways. We can contribute to business, we can contribute through NGOs, we can contribute to small-scale activities. As an IGO, representing the interests of states, we always come from the perspective that to have a well-functioning system in the country, you have to have a well-functioning government. And there it's important whether or not, you believe in the system of governance that's back in the institutions of the home country, to try and support it as best you can. There are obviously an exceedingly great number of challenges when you think about contributing back to fragile states. The first that comes to mind may be that, in fact, the country itself may not actually know what kind of resources it needs within the government. And although IOM has been implementing programs of voluntary return for highly skilled nationals for more than 30 years, one of the greatest challenges is to identify needs within the government institutions. The second major challenge relates to how you address needs when you've identified these specific needs, to the supply of very eager and very willing diaspora members that you have in any one given country. Often the types of programs that are set up by international organizations, by NGOs, are heavily criticized because maybe they encourage diaspora tourism, that it encourages somebody to go back for a couple of weeks, months, to go back to the country that they know well, and maybe to just spend some time with their family and not really necessarily contribute in the right way, or in a way that is sustainable. So that's a big challenge. It really requires some thought about how you can identify recruitment practices, terms of reference, different support services for people going back, whether it be housing, whether it be security, to ensure that the diaspora member can really make the kind of contribution that would be helpful. Another real challenge in supporting institution building in fragile states relates to the mechanisms in host countries. And how many times do we hear, well, I'd love to go back, I'd love to work in my home country, but I can't really because that would mean taking time off work, I have kids, I have bills. It's not really possible. So there's a fine balance between helping people to go back, bearing in mind that we're educated, we have often more resources than our fellow countrymen who are living back in the country that we want to go back to and support. And on the other hand, possibly creating tensions with those home communities precisely because they didn't have the opportunities of leaving in the first place. And they didn't have the resources and the education that the diaspora members have to be able to contribute to the institution building back in their home country. And the final point with regard to challenges that I see is really how to ensure in the longer term that the programs of support can work. And one example that I'd like to highlight, which is developing, it's growing, and it's in its first phases, is a program for temporary return within the institutional structures of Somalia. Now this program offers individuals to go back to Somalia for periods of up to 6 months to contribute to the public administration, to human resource management and public finance management. One of the strengths, I believe, in this program is that at all points, all the challenges that I've just tried to set out, there have been concrete attempts to try and make the selection process as transparent and as open as possible, meaning that the selection is not just done by individuals on the ground who may favour certain groups or certain beneficiaries, but is done in such a way that various groups of stakeholders sit and decide, based on the profile of the individual who wants to return, whether that person indeed possesses the skills, the know-how, the experience to be able to make the contribution. And finally, maybe a plug for some of the recommendations I've been outlining. There is a publication and a joint policy note that IOM has done with OECD, which looks at some of how to strengthen government capacities through diaspora return post-conflict and fragile states. And that's something I'd be happy to share with you in electronic form afterwards. Thank you.